Well, it's been snowing outside. So I guess that means we need to check the heating system. Actually, the ideal time to have checked this would have been back in September, October, November, but for demonstration purposes, I'm doing it now. So this is a radiator that uses hot water, and it's provided on the end with a bleeder. See the little bleeder right there? Camera? Before you start bleeding any water from radiators, you need to go down to your boiler. Here's my boiler. And here's the return and the supply. See, they go up to the headers there that run through the building. And then there's the runouts that go to the radiator where we were just at. And then there's an expansion tank. And on the return, this is the return, where it goes down to the boiler. And this is the suction side of the pump, where it goes into the boiler. There is a T right here, and a valve. And we can follow this back to a pressure regulator, and a backflow preventer, and then another valve. So before you start doing anything, make sure both of these valves are turned on, particularly if you're doing this at the beginning of this heating season and you do a complete shutdown or whatever. Just make sure they're on. Ideally, it would be great to have a pressure gauge here somewhere, although I believe there is one on the boiler that could be used. You see there's a pressure gauge there. That's a combination pressure and temperature gauge. And you're gonna use that to set, with the pump not running, set this regulator, because what this is doing, this is taking the domestic cold water coming in and reducing it down to a lower pressure to go in the system. And you can look this up online. I'm not gonna have an exact number that I'm going to regurgitate from memory here, but it's like 1 psi for every about 2.3 foot of head. And so the distance from the boiler to the highest radiator in the system, you're going to set the regulator to that pressure so that you know that water is going to make it all the way up. And you're going to make sure you got a regulator there and it works, because you don't want full domestic water pressure on all your pipes and your radiators, because domestic water pressure can range between about 60 and 75, maybe even 80 psi, plus or minus. It just depends on your location. Okay, having checked the makeup water and everything down at the boiler, I'm ready now to go to my first radiator that I want to bleed. And I've just selected a radiator. Ideally, if you know how your system is laid out, you might want to start with the radiator nearest the boiler and then work your way to the radiator furthest, or the opposite way. Go to the radiators on the second floor and start there. I'm sure there's a bunch of different opinions about doing it, but I would start at the radiator nearest the boiler, especially if I was refilling a system. But just doing a check, just pick a radiator. And so this is a 15 column radiator. It's a pretty good size, a 15 section 3 column radiator, I mean. It's a pretty good size radiator. And since I'm doing this one-handed, so because I've got a camera, I've got a container that somebody else has already made long ago for this. And then I'm going to use the radiator key here and insert that in there. And if this radiator needs bled, when I open this up, air will come out, and I'll just have to sit there and since the regulator is going to have the pressure be rather low, it'll take a while for air to come out. But if this radiator is bled and not airlocked, then I should get water. Okay, close that off pretty firm and then wipe the drip off. So I got water there instantly. So this radiator is bled. And the water was nice and clear too. So the system is in good shape and the radiator is operating its maximum efficiency, it's totally full of water. If when I had put the key in there and opened it, and if I got air, then I would need to sit there and let the air purge out as the water filled up into the radiator. And depending on how the regulator is set, that could take a long time, especially if it's set correctly up on the second floor. There should be just enough pressure for the water to reach the second floor, or whatever the highest radiator is, and no more. In fact, when I bled these radiators, and I did the ones upstairs, I'm on the lower level right now. It's a 2-story system. I did have one radiator up there that had air in it, and it did take a while for the air to get bled out. When it did bleed out, it was just a small stream like this is, you know. So that tells me that there's not a lot of pressure on that regulator. That the regulator is set pretty correctly there, that it's not just spraying out. But that's important that the regulator is on, and I wanted to explain why. Because the makeup water has to be on in order for there to be anything to the push water into the system and then push the air out when you bleed these. If the makeup water is shut off or the regulator is not working, there's no way to get water back into the system. So it's very important that all be working. That I said, you know, the distance from the lowest point in the system, which should be the boiler, to the highest point in the system, and then adjust the regulator accordingly. Like I said, it's about it's about 1 psi for every about 2.3 feet. Now, I would look that up. I would not trust what I'm saying, but that's seems to be about what the ballpark is. You don't want to have this. You don't want to have your radiators all pressured up to city water pressure. You want them to be running at a lower pressure, especially older. You know, this radiator here is 114 years old, so I don't want. You know, I'm sure it could take 50 or 60 psi, but there's no reason to run it that high. There's no reason to run the system that high. It only takes, you know, however, you know, do the math, however much psi it needs to get to the top of the system to make sure that the system is not airlocked, is totally filled with water, and then just don't go any further. You go like a half a psi, 1 psi over, just so that you know, but you know, that's about it. Don't get crazy with it. Anyway, this has been OK Bridges, and I hope this helps you out with the basics of bleeding your radiators.